Kalispera σας. Good evening. It is a great pleasure to welcome to the Archaeological Research Unit Professor Rebecca Sweetman, a colleague from the Department of Ancient History and Archaeology at the University of St. Andrews, where she has been working since 2003. Professor Sweetman received her undergraduate degree in Archaeology and Classics from University College Dublin and her PhD from the University of Nottingham. Her doctoral thesis focused on Roman and early Christian mosaics of Crete and was subsequently published by Cambridge University Press. Professor Sweetman was also the assistant director of the British School at Athens for some time. She has collaborated on a number of archaeological projects, including the Acropolis Basilica, Sparta, and Philakopion Milos. She has, in other words, had a long and constant relationship with Greece, and this explains, I suppose, her excellent command of the Greek language. You don't see that many, especially here, I must say. Her most recent research concerns networks, economy, and religion in the Cyclades in the Roman and late Antique period. She's the author of The Mosaics of Roman Crete and editor of Roman Colonies in the First Century of the Foundation. Rebecca is also directing a project which has been digitizing a collection of Cypriot material at St. Andrews, and I had the chance to play with the project, and she will say a few words about it before the lecture. And this examines the role of digital archaeology in enjoyment and memory retention of material, culture, and museum context. And I really encourage you to visit the site and play with it. It's really very interesting. She has, of course, published widely her research in academic journals, conferences, and edited volumes. The title of her lecture this evening is Christianization in the Aegean, Pilgrims, Ports, and Pottery. Rebecca.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming along. I know it's a busy night for everyone. The Mosaic Conference is dominating everything, so I really appreciate you guys being here. I know some of you have even ducked out from the Mosaic Conference to come here, so that's extra great. I'd like to thank Thanasis and Lina for their warm welcome and hospitality. And I'm actually here in Cyprus as part of the St. Andrews University of Cyprus Levendius Exchange Fellowship, which is a cumbersome name. We must come up with an acronym for that at some point, which is now in its fourth year. And it means that every other year a colleague from the university comes over to visit us in really warm and sunny St. Andrews, and we get to come over to the very difficult place of Cyprus. So we know who gets the better deal on that one. And actually, we're hoping to develop even further connections in the near future. So with your patience and permission, I'm going to give you a very quick introduction to the project that we're working on. I mean, I wouldn't normally undermine my other lecture with another lecture, except that it's Cypriot material that we're working on, and actually quite a lot of the material, because it's a private collection, not collected by the university, it was donated to the university, it was collected in the 1960s. Because it's a private collection, we don't know the context of most of the material, as I'm sure you all understand. So this collection is part of the university collections now. St. Andrews is up here, not even on the west coast of Scotland, where it's a little more temperate, but on the east coast of Scotland. And we have a collection of mostly medieval material. So St. Andrews is a well-known pilgrimage town in the medieval period, and we have quite a lot of big, dirty medieval things like these maces here. But we were given this collection of about 184 artifacts from Cyprus, and it ranges from kind of Bronze Age material right up until Byzantine. There's no rhyme or reason to it except that they're all whole pots, they're all mostly whole figurines, and what we have been trying to do is we've been digitizing it. So we've been creating 3D models of nearly all the collection now, and putting them online so that everybody can have access to those models. And that's why I gave you out these bookmarks, because it's got the details of the website and things like that on that. So if you're interested in finding more Cypriot material, that's where you can go. And one of my students who's working on it at the moment said, "Tell them it's on Twitter too." So She'd be annoyed if I didn't tell you about that. Anyway, so we have this collection of material. We've been digitizing it, not just though to make it available to the public, but we've been digitizing it in order to undertake a couple of experiments. And we wanted to understand how people perceive of artifacts, archaeological material in different ways, depending on how they experience it in different ways. So we know, for example, that the medium of museums divorce the cultural understanding quite often. So you have slightly bizarre situations where people can be having a smiley conversation over essentially a dead person lying here. So museums kind of at a basic level can separate you from the deeper understanding of the archaeological material. So our first kind of experiment was to try and understand how different media of experiencing those objects changed our interpretation of the objects. So what we did was we devised an experiment. We tested 99 people, including my poor children, who are, you'll see them regularly on this slide because they're guinea pigs. No, they're lovely children. So that we had a potter, a local St. Andrew's potter, recreate some of the material. So, for example, he recreated a lamp. You can see him making the spindle whorl here, and you'll see some of those creations that he did. And it was really interesting talking to him as well about the difficulties of making something like a spindle whorl, the difficulties of making something like a lamp that looks so straightforward like this, and again, the difficulties of getting the correct weights. And it was very important to us that everything weighed the same as the original object and that it was as like the original object as you could possibly get. So we did use the digital material, and we set up a case like this, so a fairly standard museum case with information panels, and we had a feelie box, which is one of these things that, kind of anthropology museums or natural history museums where people can stick their hands in and guess what's in the box. So it was one of these feelie boxes. The adults, when it came to the feelie box, there was no way they wanted to stick their hands in the feelie box, because obviously we were going to put scorpions or something like that on it. And you can see some of George's reconstructions here. And so we put the reconstructions in the feelie boxes so people could touch it, feel it, lift it, and play with it in as many ways as they wanted. And then we had the 3D reconstructions, as we'll show you in a second, and we had actual handling of the material. Now, the kind of initial results were that kids loved the feelie boxes. That's not really surprising. But once we persuaded the adults to stick their hands in the feelie boxes, they too really enjoyed the feelie boxes. What the feelie boxes did was they encouraged people to go back to the case, try and spot the object that was in the case, and then read about what that object was in the case. So it wasn't a straightforward, they got lots of information from the feelie box, but they used it as a trigger to go back to the case. When they were at the case, they didn't spend very much time looking at the labels or anything like that. They looked at the case and then wandered off. So it was a really good way of getting people to go back to the case. And particularly children, they would feel the object in the feelie box and then go back and try and find it and see what was going on. With the digital reconstructions, generally speaking, if you're over the age of 18, they didn't really like it. Our students didn't really like it because it wasn't the real thing. And kind of older people didn't really like it because to them it was just another image online. So it wasn't anything special. The fact that you could turn it around didn't really mean a whole lot to people. But for kids, it was amazing. They used it as a means to talk to each other. So one person would be on the computer playing with the images and then talking to people behind them saying, look what this is, and wanting to explore more about the image. But that's because kids watch each other playing YouTube games and stuff like that. So it's a standard practice now for children. Everybody loved handling the pottery. There's no question about that. But when we asked people what their impressions of it were, when they saw it in a case, they said it's art because it's in a case, somebody has chosen it, so it's a precious object. When they handled it, whether it was in the feelie box or in real life, they said they could feel the weight. They could feel, for example, one of the pots has a thumbprint on it. They could feel the potter's thumbprint. And so they talked about it as artifacts, or they talked about it as a utilitarian object, regardless of the decoration or anything like that. So they got a much greater connection to the maker. So we did these, in fact the article's coming out in a couple of weeks. We did these experiments, but we weren't really content with that, because what we then wanted to do was to see how well people remembered information depending on how they experienced the objects. And so we've been testing more people. Actually, we're running out of people. St. Andrews is very small. So should you want to come and be tested in St. Andrews? So we've tested about 60 individuals, and they're all adults because we have to set up a whole set of other experiments for kids. And what we have found, our kind of preliminary results are that it's the same set of things. So they're looking at the glass case, they're looking at the material online, and then they're handling the material. Without doubt, everybody loves to handle the material. That's their favorite aspect of it. And the last thing that they like is the digital interaction. But without fail, nobody remembers very much about handling it. They all remember it from the digital interaction. So very bizarrely, enjoyment does not equal good memory. It seems to be digital interaction, for some reason, is prompting a greater memory retention of the material. I know. But we need to do one more experiment, because we're wondering if people are really nervous about dropping like 3,000-year-old objects or something like that. And so we're going to get standard kitchen utensils and run the exact same experiment. So they're handling things like a cereal bowl or something like that, so that there's not so many nerves going, and hopefully we'll cancel out the possibility that they're nervous about that. And then the last thing I want to do with this is, so this is our collection online. Is just to see if anybody has got any ideas about this particular woman. Now, let me see if she'll come up. As if by magic. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. The last one. All this for one object. I'm so sorry.
We're more curious now.
I know. It's going to be such a letdown. No. Dora. Okay, here she is. So this is our kind of, I would love if anyone, if anyone knows who she is or what she's doing, you can tell me, but at least give me a pause so it's not 100% obvious. Now, I've asked lots of people who work in Cypriot material, like Thomas Kennelly in the BM. I've asked various art historians in the US and other people who work on Cypriot material. There's a lot of parallels for her in terms of the seated pose, and we can flip her around a bit and you can see the rams a bit better. She's got 2 rams either side. I kind of wondered if she was a Phoenician goddess or a Shara. I wondered if maybe, but the problem with that is that she's very overdressed to be her. If it was a man, we'd have no problem with it being Zeus Ammon. But any takers at all? Any suggestions? No? Can you show your friends and family and everyone? And if you find out, can you please let me know? In fact, you'll find her on this handy bookmark. So if you can, do let me know. She's definitely from Cyprus. Now, this is not going to work again. Okay. So thank you for letting me hijack some of that time. I am going to now talk about Christianization in the Aegean. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the processes of Christianization. Christians actively sought to convert others. There's a dynamic sense of purpose to conversion, and the term Christianization refers to both the means and the consequence of this conversion. While the results are often discussed in contemporary scholarship, theorizing the practical process still lags behind. The consequence of this has been that although a great deal has been done to counter traditional views of the negative elements of conversion, such as, for example, destruction of temples, and even highlight the more positive aspects, such as a peaceful transition, we're still left with really quite nebulous views of how and why Christianization was so successful. This has led to generalizations regarding the timing and the extent of Christianization in various places based on factors such as presence of Jewish communities, geography, relative distance from the Holy Land, and women get thrown in there as a kind of a random catalyst for Christianization as well. And of course, Paul too. This is partly a consequence of the evidence. Literary data is polarized between pro and anti-Christian views. The proselytizing necessities of Christians meant that it was advantageous to disseminate ideas of tension between Christians and non-Christians, which included destruction of the old symbols of polytheism and a powerful sense of victory. Moreover, literary sources of the past paid little attention to recording or discussing how Christianity spread. On the one hand, this might seem surprising since there was such an effort to promote the idea of Christianization and the intentional and active elements of it. But on the other, it's kind of understandable when you think about it, such a slow process happening over a period of 4 centuries. Stark has, for example, suggested a rate of 3.42% of people were converting every year, which is tiny. In addition to disagreement between the sources themselves, for example, when Christians speak of destruction and victory, and non-Christians such as Eunapius speak of the Christian darkness in the 4th century, the archaeological evidence, on the other hand, points to significant levels of integration, and it doesn't really tally with these literary viewpoints. Material remains reveal shared religious and cultural elements in burial, in importance of place, as well as in art and architecture. And Christian engagement within communities encouraged adaptation. The construction of the first churches, in fact, marks a point when Christians have the networks, resources, conviction, and support to make their religion public. Sociological approaches have identified 2 catalysts for religious or social change, that is, tension or emergent. It's been argued that monumental Christianization is a result of strategic processes and not really the result of tension. So in the old days, when everybody talked about the decline of the city in the late antique period, often Christianization was cast in those terms, in terms of, well, it was a very bad period, people weren't getting on with each other, there were lots of earthquakes, so it was cast in terms of a tension that created this social change. Strategic processes, though, allow for a combination of targeted and emergent change, and 3 different developments of conversion have been identified on the basis of the topography of the late antique churches, and this is particularly in the Peloponnese. So we have complexity, social movement, and tipping point. To summarize, using the example of the Peloponnese, the earliest churches are located as a result of complexity. So the earliest churches are located at ports, major ports, and at the edges of really popular sanctuaries. So, for example, Epidavros, Olympia, they're not necessarily located at sanctuaries that have gone out of use. So Isthmia, there isn't a church, an early church at that point. Once they're constructed, and this is Kenkriai, once they're constructed at these places, social movement denotes the spread of ideas through competitive elements of seeking what others have. So it's this kind of sense of competing with your neighbours. And in most cases, this represents the spread of churches from ports and sanctuaries to towns such as Argos and Corinth. So it moves, so you see the red dots are the original, or stars are the original churches, and then they start moving through networks into urban spaces. So from, say, Kenkriai into Corinth, and then into Argos as well. And then finally, this is in Argos, and actually when they start going into the towns, the earliest churches are either at gateways into the town, so rather than in the urban space itself, or in existing cemeteries, which are generally outside the walls. The final step is tipping point, when there's and this is much later, when there's a kind of a mass of churches, a kind of a groundswell of churches that tip over into the most conservative of areas, and that is into the rural areas. And you can see these are marked on the map by the blue stars here. Now, these conservative areas, they need, because they're rural areas and they don't have those networks, those tight networks that places like towns have, they tend to put their churches on really visible sites, so on hilltops, like these examples at Yeraki, or else at gathering spots, so quite often at springs or fountains, or places that people would gather for other reasons. The increased distribution of churches represent decisions made and articulated through different kinds of mobility, geographic, social, and religious, and all of these are network connections. So the aim of this paper is to explore the links and networks behind these planned and unplanned conversions. The starting point for this discussion is an examination of the archaeological data from urban spaces in the Eastern Empire. A much more substantial study is actually needed to be able to include all the rural material, so we're just going to focus on urban today, and actually the historical data is too patchy too. While many cities may claim to have an early Christian population, it's not always supported through external data. Therefore, the focus will be on the monumentalization of Christianity, that is to say, the construction of the earliest churches. And it'll be argued here that the Christianization of these areas was a successful product of weak and strong ties, as well as horizontal and vertical connections. Christianity was not an exclusive religion bound to particular communities, and it actively included diverse identities within the specific formula of religious practice. Moreover, the size of the area that was converted and the diversity of regions, communities, and individuals within makes it difficult to encapsulate the macro view of everything, the macro view of Christianization, rather than focusing on individual regions. Recent developments in network analysis and its application to archaeological data make such a challenge more feasible. Furthermore, it enables a means of seeing how different regions relate to each other with the common denominator of the early church as a comparator. So let's just have a quick look at some of the definitions for different types of ties that make up networks. Strong ties, the first one up here, are those links between family and very close friends, so ties that bind communities together. But the presence of random weak ties enables the easy transmission of information between separate groups or clusters, and they have been apparently observed in many different situations across time and space, ranging from the archaic Greeks to the spread of disease epidemic in modern America. Horizontal transmission refers to peer-to-peer diffusion process, often copying character, that is, innovation that's spread through observation, emulation. Whereas by contrast, vertical transmission requires a depth of knowledge and experience. So for instance, through conditioned learning, and then the cultural traditions inherited from family and lived environment. Thank you. Price argued that the spread of religion, in this case Christianity, was in part because of Christians working and travelling within and between already established groups of Christians, and that the act of moving within the empire itself didn't just create new cults, that there needed to be communities of like-minded people already there, so communities to be nodes around which to create the networks. So if we have a look at that, the initial stages of Christianization in the 1st and 2nd centuries were dependent on development and growth through very personal connections in the form of early missionaries. So, for example, Paul. And I mean, Paul was quite strategic in lots of ways in that he traveled with friends and associates And then when he went to a certain place, he would leave them. So he left Barnabas in Antioch, he left Titus in Crete, Aquila and Priscilla at Ephesus. And these early missionaries, they're likely to have family and friends in the Jewish diaspora, creating these strong ties. However, these early missions had limited visible achievements. Even Paul himself is well known for overcompensating in his writings for the limited success that he had, rather than having any more obvious evidence of attainment. So, for example, if we have a look quickly at Corinth, the earliest churches, and Betsy just looked up, the earliest churches in Corinth are the Quadratus Church here and Cranion possibly too. Now, these churches are not constructed anywhere where it's related to Paul in any way. They're constructed on the edge of the town, and in fact, this one here, the Quadratus Basilica, is constructed in an existing cemetery. So exactly as I said before, they're constructed on the edges of towns, usually outside the walls, in existing spaces where people are travelling regularly to those spaces. So they're making it fairly easy for people to see those churches. So what they're doing, these early churches, are really drawing on the memory and tradition of visiting. The limited success of Christianization through these strong ties may be due to a range of reasons, including the singular ethnos of the groups being evangelized, the lack of diversity of connections, a lack of an organized process, and the limited interest that the powerful and elite had in Christianity at this time. Essential in any kind of change were weak ties, partly to create repetition. Trade routes provided the conduits, and well-trodden patterns of travelling the same route helped consolidate the connections made by weak ties. Weak ties had significant strength and broader spread than strong ties. In the early centuries of Christianity, places such as Corinth, Antioch, and Ephesus, as trading emporia, had huge numbers of weak ties, and indeed strong ties. So, why is it not working? Why does it take Christianity so long to begin to gather momentum? It's argued that transmission was more complex and dependent on weak and strong ties at different points, so calling it a time-varying network would help, and that a combination of these connections and indeed social mobility were required for the successful spread of Christianity. So to illustrate this, we're going to have a look at a number of different urban spaces, these ones here. So we'll look at Salamis, Paragia, Antioch, Ephesus, Athens, and Edessa, with comparative examples from Corinth, Apamea, and Pergamon a little bit. These 6 cities have been chosen for a number of reasons. They're of the largest cities in the empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, well, 4th centuries, say, not Paragia, but they're all in they're all hugely diverse cities in terms of their populations. They're in different provinces, they're in different kind of topographic situations, and that they're all situated at a range of distances from the Holy Land. I'll give a little bit more focus to the islands, the Cycladic Islands, and to Athens as extreme examples of early and late monumentalization, respectively. Following a brief summary of the 6 cities and evidence for the earliest church building, a synopsis of trade networks will be presented. The issue of how to connect the Christianization processes in these cities that are so different from each other in terms of size, location, and population will be addressed through the application of network analysis. This will enable not just a better understanding of the practicalities of Christianization, but will highlight the importance of mobility, place, tradition, and choice in the adoption of the new religion. So to go to the first site, Salamis. As you all know, it's located on the east coast of Cyprus, and of the 6 towns, it's actually the closest to Jerusalem in terms of time that it would have taken. So it's only 6.5 days to get to Jerusalem by sea from Salamis. It's got everything going for it in the Roman period. It's got sources of income in terms of the mines, it's got wood, Trajan and Hadrian really liked it, but then it got slammed by a couple of earthquakes in the kind of first half of the 4th century, and it was rebuilt on a significant scale later by the Emperor Constantius II. The earliest church in Salamis is Epiphanius, which is dated apparently to the 4th century. Now, The cities of the east coast of Cyprus are in an excellent position because they are really accessible by those travelling on the pilgrimage route. And the churches are positioned very often on the east coast as well, which takes advantage of any passing pilgrim traffic if they can. So it's likely to have been a kind of a knock-on effect in terms of cashing in on the potential for outside money coming in. The city of Antioch was not too far away in that it was located 7 days from Jerusalem, and it was also on a lucrative trade route from the north and south, but also from the east. So it was on the Silk Road from the east, and it was also on the river Orontes as well. So it was perfect mix of potential for lots of different networks. It was the provincial capital of Syria, and indeed it was one of the largest in the areas. It was the kind of mixed cultures, the mixed religions that were in Antioch were commented on by writers frequently. There are lots of churches in Antioch that haven't, or martyria indeed, that haven't really been excavated. The earliest one is only really known from literary sources, the Pallia. But the next one, the Pallia was possibly destroyed in the late 3rd century and then rebuilt early in the 4th century. And then shortly after, the great church was possibly constructed on the island. This is a digital reconstruction, possibly constructed on the island here. And then this was followed by the foundation of the Church of St. Babylas here. So up to about 23 churches were then constructed in the city, and it grew massively in importance in the 4th century. So Valens visited the city, for example, and reopened many of the churches that had been closed by Julian when he was there creating trouble. So the city grew in importance in the 4th century massively. It became really well known for its Christian population, of course, and then we know that lots of pilgrims and visitors went to see various relics of Procopius, Marinus Phocus, for example, and Michael the Archangel. St. Thomas, but they were in the Church of Michael the Archangel. Ephesus, too, was a city of significant size, but it was about 13 days away from Jerusalem, and it thrived in its well-networked position. It had a massive multicultural population as well, and it was extensively rebuilt in the 4th century by Constantine. So we've got, for example, lots of investment in the churches in the city, the Church of St. John and the Church of St. Mary too. In contrast, Edessa, which is located here, took much longer to get to, 17 days at least to get to Edessa from Jerusalem. But the kind of strange thing about Edessa is that it's one of the earliest Christian populations that have seemed to be building churches. And this may be partly because the royal family of Edessa became Christian in the late 2nd century with the conversion of Abgar the 9th. So the royal family is very early Christian, and it's likely to have had a very early church in the city, which is in evidence mostly from the Chronicle of Edessa, which covers a period of about mid-2nd century to mid-6th century. It mentions the destruction of the church in 201 by flooding. So the problem we have with Edessa, though, is that there's very little left of the archaeological material from that period. A lot of it is reworked into the more recent castle of Urfa, which you see on the slide here. But it maintained a number of different religions very successfully, including Christianity, and it thrived as a Christian center. In fact, people argue that Edessa was like its own kind of hub in spreading Christianity in that area around it. We know, for example, Egeria went to Edessa, not necessarily to go to Edessa itself, but to go to Caria, which was close by, and she broke her journey at Edessa to go here, which was where Rebecca met Isaac at the well. But she commented on Edessa saying it was like the end of the world, or the earth. Evidence in Athens, though, for early Christian groups are really quite late. St. Paul had a shot, but had fairly lackluster attempts to convert the population in the 50s. During the first half of the 3rd century, Athens was renowned as a centre for education and a centre for culture. But this was brought to a really tragic end by the Herulian invasions in 267. According to some, it took about a century to recover back to its kind of bubbling self. But shortly after, it was supposedly invaded by Alaric and the Goths, although that's a whole other discussion. But after about another century, so in about the 5th century, early 5th century, after a long hiatus, a rebuilding and reinvestment in the city starts again with the financing of places like the Library of Hadrian. Actually, I should have said that's the post-Herulian wall, which runs through the Agora and successfully kind of cuts off the old classical Agora and contracts the size of the city. So the investment starts again in the early 5th century with reconstructions, for example, at the Library of Hadrian, and then shortly around the same time there is one of the earliest churches in the city constructed, which is the Iliopsoas Basilica at the edge of town, so it's near where the stadium is in Athens now. It's several church constructions follow after this, and it depends on whether you believe that the Library of Hadrian tetraconch is a church or not. But several churches follow, and then in the 6th century we've got a situation where some of the temples in the city are converted into churches, but only after many other churches on the suburbs have been constructed. So some have suggested that the lateness of church building in Athens is partly due to the strength of the philosophical schools there. And to be fair, I wanted not to agree with this, but there actually may be some weight in this suggestion, given the fact that Apamea, which is similarly renowned for its Neoplatonic school, also has somewhat later church constructions than its neighbour Antioch. So even though it's close to Jerusalem, and you would expect a whole lot of church building going on here, there isn't a whole lot until the mid-5th century. And it has a very strong philosophical school as well. But there's another element too, and it may be that a pattern of disturbed imperial and elite investment in the city may have a significant role to play in the delay in Athens, and indeed other places like Pergamon, who were floored by the Goths as well. Let's have a quick look at the Cyclades before we go back to that, though. In addition to the literary evidence attesting the presence of Cycladic bishops at the early ecumenical councils, there's quite prolific archaeological data, particularly from the Christian catacombs of Milos, to say that they were in use from the 2nd to the 4th centuries. A few of the tombs have Christian epithets, and you can see just about one of them here. And then there's a set of Christian epithets as well from Kea, which are in Athens now, mostly in Athens, dating from the 3rd, possibly 4th and 5th century. Communities of Jews have been identified through literary and epigraphic evidence on Delos, on Thera, Paros, Naxos, and Milos. And then some people would say that there's a synagogue on Delos as well. The earliest churches in the Cyclades are found on Paros and Amorgos. So we can see Paros and Amorgos here. Now, at Amorgos, there is this apsidal building. I promise it's an apsidal building. There's not a whole lot to see there now, but it's an apsidal building, which may well be an early house church constructed in the 4th century. The Catapoliani church, which was built in the Roman cemetery, or just at the edge of the Roman cemetery here, has had huge amounts of debate about the date. But let's, for the sake of argument, go with Orlandos and say that the baptistry was constructed in the 4th century. Although, as I said, the pottery people don't like that. It's traditionally believed that its construction was instigated by the Empress Eleni, but finally finished by Constantine in the late 4th century. Later, Justinian supposedly was responsible for further significant architectural elaboration at the church. Actually, that's the baptistry there. And it's clear that there were intentional connections made with imperial patronage of the church, regardless of the reality of the original construction. So if we have a look at what we've seen, the earliest churches in the cities discussed are Salamis, which is in the 4th century, Antioch, 3rd or 4th, Paros, 4th, and Edessa, 3rd. Athens lies behind in the 5th century, but it's joined by places such as Apamea and Pergamon. Apamea is only 9 days away, and Pergamon is something similar. Notably, Edessa was 17 days away, so the distances aren't making a difference here. This suggests that, contrary to Stark's view, that distance to the Holy Land makes little discernible impact on the spread of Christianity, nor in fact do provincial designations. The impetus for the spread of church construction spreads quickly throughout the Cyclades, and in fact these churches are of the earliest in modern Greece. So the question remains, what are the links that make the Cyclades so early, yet Athens so late? As noted earlier, many have suggested that the spread of religion is based on weak ties. So let's look at those weak ties with a focus on trade, craftspeople, and pilgrims. Now, one of the fundamental connections that any city would have been with commercial and trade networks. And I apologize massively to all the pottery experts in the room. Thanasis, sorry. I'm about to condense years of everybody's hard work into a couple of sentences. So, here we go. Focusing on the 3rd and 4th century. Cyprus, as you know, produced its own significant quantities of sigillata, exported throughout the East and Eastern Mediterranean. Volker has noted that from the 4th century onwards, all fine wares were imported into Syria, and that there is a clear and definable difference between the distribution of vessels on the coast and on the interior. Pottery that was produced on the coast stayed on the coast. And this suggests that different types of networks were working. So even in this area, the coastal areas were different networks from the areas on inland here. Furthermore, both land and river transport were used, so towns such as Antioch and Apamea would have benefited from several different trade connections because they were on the Orontes. The early imperial levels have not really been published at Antioch and Apamea. However, recent work by Volker has been providing some really useful results. In both cases, Eastern Sigillata A is the most common import in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and it's notable that in the case of Apamea, ESA is abundant, but it's imported from those nearby locations, so it's not been moved very far. In Athens and Corinth, Chandarli dominated the pottery assemblages, and this was the same at Pergamon and Ephesus, with some ESA and ESB at Ephesus. In Cyprus, Cypriot sigillata, unsurprisingly, was the most common, but with some Eastern Sigillata A. And in Israel and Jordan, ESA dominated until the 3rd century, with some Cypriot sigillata coming in as well. And it was particularly popular in surrounding locations like Jerusalem and Jericho. Imported pottery in the Cyclades showed continued connections with, for example, the East in particular, so there's lots of Phoenician red slip, and ESA as well. And excavations at the sanctuary of Demeter on Naxos have also turned up some of these lamps, which come from a workshop on the coast of Asia Minor, Romanesis workshop type, which are found also with the same stamp on it in the Levant and Palestine. The epigraphic data from things like the graffiti at Grammata on Syros reveal a similarly Eastern-focused network. In addition to the significant evidence for local Cycladic travellers, Paros and Milos were very well connected due to their resources of marble and alum in the Roman period, which were extensively traded, creating sustained networks with the East. This is also reflected in the pottery assemblages, and it's worth noting that it's likely that ships came from the East, brought their pottery, offloaded cargo into places like Paros and Milos, and then took on board things like the alum and marble and then moved on to the West. So that partly explains why we have not huge amounts of material from the West back into the islands. So the pottery is showing a mixture of connections, particularly between Asia Minor and the Levant and the Aegean, and not a lot coming from Italy in the 3rd century. And overall, it looks like a pattern of smaller networks linked by bigger relationships, so a really good example of strong and weak ties. In addition to attracting people through trade, the cycle of investment and building within the cities in the 4th century also encourages a wide variety of craftspeople, in particular to places like Ephesus and Antioch and indeed Salamis. Most of the cities discussed here have diverse populations, some more so than others. And many, as I said, have strong Jewish populations. Athens and Apamea were known for their philosophical schools. So all of these places had trade. They all had craftspeople. They all had personal visits from Paul. They all had St. Paul. They all had a mix of strong and weak ties, but still only a small and discreet Christian community for up to 3 centuries. So it's not just trade or craftspeople that created the link. What was it? What was the catalyst for this? We'll have a look at Pilgrims and Patronage now. The idea of travel is embedded in notions of the spread of Christianity, and it can be reasonably assumed that pilgrims would have taken similar routes, if not actually the same, as those as commercial vessels. Paul travelled along the Via Egnatia, as we've seen already, as well as by sea to the main ports along the Mediterranean, like, of course, Corinth and Thessaloniki. Pilgrims, such as Egeria, also travelled along established trade routes, and as I said, when she went to Edessa, she talked about leaving the well-trodden route. In addition to physical pilgrimage, which would in turn imbue a sense of ownership of the space as well as connectedness, pilgrims created networks through letters, stories, travel, and communication. This helped to maintain connections between cities, between clergy, politicians, and elite. The importance of social mobility comes into play here, where we see that pilgrimage in the late antique period was as much about the journey and the ability to recount the stories after it as it was about the places visited. The expansion of the imperial system in the 4th century created new opportunities for people to become involved. The inclusion of new families meant that the existing elite had to really work to maintain their status. And one way of doing this was by going on a pilgrimage, which created social capital, and it was doing something that was increasingly important to consolidating one's place in the new religious order. So it became intrinsically connected with socio-political machinations. And this partly began with Constantine's early program to mark religious space, places of burial, burials of martyrs, and prominent bishops, particularly, but not exclusively, in Jerusalem and Palestine, thereby creating a pilgrimage network. In addition to the advertisement of one's pilgrimage through letters and stories, a key way to ensure further credit in Christian society was to become a patron of a Christian place through investment and, in particular, building. The imperial family set much of the tone for patronage of Christian expression through architectural monumentalization originally, but social movement created a situation where others wanted to emulate this. Women play a significant role in the foundation of new monasteries and hostels, and indeed in patronage of churches. And indeed, Lenski suggests that the reason why so many former imperial women went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land was that it might have been a way of escaping another marriage. One of these first imperial pilgrimages was undertaken by the Empress Eleni, mother of Constantine, who, according to Eusebius, initiated work on the Church of the Cave of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Church of the Mount of Olives, and according to tradition, the Catapoliani Church on Paros. In doing so, she encouraged Constantine specifically to continue patronage of church building, as well, more generally, the idea of pilgrimage and patronage amongst the elite. Patronage enabled social empowerment for new bishops and clergy who could display their authority and gravitas through the sponsorship of buildings, laying of mosaics or other interior decor, as well as making sure their patronage was well advertised in literary accounts. An examination of the delayed Christianization of cities in places such as Athens help us understand why it took nearly 3 centuries for the momentum to build up to a high enough level to create the monumental expression of Christianity. That is, in spite of targeted attempts to build up the population in the 1st century, regardless of the diversity of trade, population, resources, and the fact that the city had strong and weak ties, what some places lacked was targeted imperial aims to construct churches and patronage. So if we look at Athens just quickly again, there's another problem with Athens. There are no problems with Athens, but one of the problems that hit Athens in this period was the construction of the post-Herulian wall basically knocked off the classical agora. So people weren't seeing the original place where all that investment had taken place. So the classical agora was outside the main city. This is a fundamental change in the city's identity, and actually the same thing applies to Pergamon. Centuries of dedications, political machinations, and personal interactions were sidelined, breaking the topography and breaking the topography of tradition and patronage. This was compounded in the case of Athens. The city's wealthy landowners' attic holdings became depleted in the 3rd century, and in the 4th century, education was a steadier, not lucrative, a steadier business. So, Athens became increasingly known as a city of education and philosophy, and its status fluctuated from proconsular to equestrian praeses. Unlike other cities discussed here, there is a massive break in investment in Athens and indeed in Pergamon in the 4th century. Not just the break in investment, but also completely sidelining all those other monuments. Because of the break in various traditions, incentives for church building must have been a conscious decision, or it had to have been a conscious decision, and perhaps a deliberate move to attract people to the city. So, as we've seen, we've got increased investment starting to build up in the late 4th, early 5th century in Athens, and this is then encouraging other people to start building churches. Conversely, in cities such as Salamis, Antioch, Ephesus, and Aegean, epigraphic evidence shows the tradition of investment continued unabated throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries. Furthermore, all cities are known to have direct imperial input in critical times in the late antique period. So Constantine in Aegean and Ephesus, Constantius in Salamis, and Valens in Antioch. Their locations on important trade route and pilgrimage routes, as well as providing impetus for attracting pilgrims themselves, meant that ideas and, importantly, external funding continued to flow. And this helped keep the momentum of public investment in the buildings up without the kind of interruption that cities like Athens and Pergamon had. Once the churches are constructed, social mobility continues to play a role, and in many respects becomes entwined with religious mobility. The church certainly drew on the potential for social mobility to help the Christianization process. It made itself appealing and visible, but maintained quite clear divisions of space, which were used as a symbol of power. It's possible, for example, that when wealthy individuals wealthy individuals on islands, for example, who didn't have the land holdings to participate in imperial structures, were given opportunities to participate in church hierarchies, thereby changing their social status and encouraging a spread of religion. The importance of exclusivity for Christians had to be balanced with the need to Christianize, and so they used it to attract new converts. Christians preached that they were the chosen people, which further promulgated a sense of exceptionality. In the early centuries, Christians were a secret group, necessary for their own preservation, which played into the same idea of exclusivity. And this was later capitalized on by the construction of church buildings, which emphasized a focus on the interior, with secretive and somewhat restricted liturgical practices. And this would have served to encourage interest in the church, which already had drawn on the importance of place by being situated in highly visible locations, or well-visited locations. And a good example of this can be seen with the church that's on the edge of the sanctuary at Epidavros, as we very briefly mentioned early on. So this is actually the plan from the site plan on site, because very few plans of the classical sanctuary or Hellenistic sanctuary bother to include the very fine 5-aisled late antique basilica here. So it's right on the edge. So the propylea, the entranceway into the sanctuary, is here. And then you couldn't miss the late antique church if you were going into the main area of Epidavros. The late antique church, as you can see the remains of here, was on your left. The very visible church would have created a sense of curiosity about it. And we know that from epigraphic data that when the church was being built, the sanctuary was still in use. So we know that it continued probably for its earliest phases in use. It's been argued that over time, converts would have gone to the church instead, or perhaps even as well as, the sanctuary of Asclepius. Importantly, in terms of social mobility, it's likely that similar processions followed the unchanged routes that would have terminated at the new church. So they're not changing anything except providing a different religion. Small change. The church and community hierarchy became intrinsically linked. And it's likely that the same hierarchical structures would have continued in the Christian procession, thereby providing a very visible opportunity for integration in the new social structures. And then within the churches themselves, there were defined levels of spatial hierarchies. So this is a digital reconstruction of the Acropolis Basilica in Sparta. And you can see here, this is the narthex here. The most obvious kind of spatial division is between the narthex and the rest of the church, and the catechumens would have had to have squished themselves in here. And indeed, it's likely that the closer one was to the altar and rituals being undertaken, the more important that individual was considered. Tiered space was also shown through different levels of visibility of the altar and rituals. So, for example, a location at the western edge of either the north aisle or this is the south aisle here would have given you really good views of what was going on the altar. But if you were in the wrong part of that, the columns would have obstructed that view. So there's all sorts of play going on in the space and in terms of hierarchy within the space as well. Altogether, the location of the church, the enclosed space, the public processions, and secret rituals visible to a hierarchy of believers would have provided numerous means of changing one's social status, either positively or indeed negatively. In all, Christianization processes are the result of evolving networks of strong and weak ties that change over time. They draw on a range of processes simultaneously, and their flexibility and mix of planned and organic change lead to a successful Christianization of the Mediterranean. Importantly, evolving networks allow for particular nodes to have periods of activeness or popularity, which in turn are likely to create future links. And this helps to explain the underlying connections that imperial attention in various cities creates in terms of attracting investment. In all, Christianization was successful because it was considered yet flexible, and it had patronage. Thank you. Thanks.
So thank you very much for your very thorough presentation of through a wide range of material, both textual but also archaeological, to the process of Christianization, with specific reference to well-known sites in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean. So thank you very much, and thank you for introducing us to your digitization project, which is still in progress, I believe.
Yeah.
We'll certainly visit it. I'm sure you're prepared to receive potential questions and comments
Sure.
from the audience. Αν έχετε ερωτήσεις λοιπόν, σχόλια για την Ρεβέκα. Yes, please.
Betsy.
So I know you wanted to talk more about Corinth, but couldn't because you talked about your 3D work. But can you say more about Corinth? Because you gave us the two outside churches. Of course, there's Aegean, and my sense is the pattern is very much like Athens, and you can see in the late orators that there's a very strong kind of traditional link there. It's very much part of that world. So is there a time lag? I feel like there's a time lag in that pagan stuff is going strong, but then there's also the sense that it will remain part of the Latin side of the church for a long time. So what's going on at Corinth in this moment?
Thanks, Betsy. Betsy works at Corinth, so she's a Corinth. Well, so at Corinth, it's earlier. Everything happens earlier than in Athens. So Athens really is much later than everybody else in these respects. So traditionally, it was said, well, because you have the polytheistic governor in Achaea, that Christianization processes were much later there. But actually, it's probably not the case. In Corinth, the Aegean Basilica date has changed now, so it's much later than they originally thought it was. So in the city proper, the latest church to be built within the city proper is actually the conversion of the Temple of Apollo. So the church and the conversion of the Temple of Apollo, and that's in the 7th century. But before that, there's a series of churches built in the 5th century all around the edges of the city. And up on top of Acro, there's a church built into the sanctuary of Aphrodite as well, but that's a late one as well. So it's a similar kind of pattern. You have churches on the outside in spaces where there are graves, burials, martyria, and then they start moving into the city as it kind of gathers apace.
It's still a very traditional, thriving traditional culture into the 6th century.
Well, in Corinth is another good example because we've got lots and lots of burial data, and where you have lots of really nice mixtures of, say, a Christian burial, but with the coins put on the burial to pay Chiron for travelling over safely. So there's, and also in inscriptions and things like that, and so Michael Wallbank's stuff.
Yeah, like up there in the northern
Yeah,
cemeteries.
yeah.
So
So I would.
duality, really.
Yes. Yes. So I would say that we have in the even with the construction of the churches that there's still a thriving polytheistic population. Thank you.
You mentioned 2 churches at Corinth again, built within cemeteries, but you didn't mention the date of the cemeteries. Are they pagan or Christian?
They're Roman cemeteries, so they're not Christian necessarily, but you've asked a really good question because it's really difficult to tell what's actually a Christian burial before like 4th, 5th century anyway. And so they could be some Christian burials, but they're not likely to be exclusively Christian burials at that point. So it's a standard Roman cemetery. There may well be Christians buried there, but unless we have a gravestone that gives it away, or unless there's kind of a particular symbol on a gravestone, we have really nice examples where people are being cursed. So that it's a Christian burial, but they'll be cursed if you touch the grave. So there's, I mean, in Corinth in particular, there's some good combos of things, but it's very difficult to tell a really straightforward Christian burial. What some people are arguing now for places like Lerna Hollow, which is the cemetery beside the sanctuary of Asclepius, is that the increase in children's burials in Lerna Hollow marks a point when they become more Christian because they're including the children within the burial areas rather than excluding them outside in different areas. It's a good question, but hard.
I'm asking this question because in the occupied area of Cyprus, in northern Cyprus, from Akan through, I don't know if you know the names of the village, up to Komikebir, we located a number of cemeteries which are dated to the Hellenistic and Roman period. And within all of them, we found a church.
Ah, excellent.
So that's why I'm asking.
I love you.
Pagan,
Yes, and I mean the churches are, what I would argue is that the church is drawing on traditional polytheistic things like procession to burials, procession to temples, in order to help situate the church in a peaceful way. Because it doesn't do anyone any good to try and hammer in a new religion, because nobody's going to take it. And so if you put it into a place where you draw on existing tradition, then I think it helps a peaceful integration. And we definitely see much more evidence for populations living side by side and using different kinds of, borrowing different kinds of traits from each other, yeah. But yeah, that's great.
you have another color.
That's brilliant. No, thank you. Thank you. Fantastic.
I'm a novice. So when they actually move in and transform the temples, you say it's around 7th century mostly?
From
Is there a reason? I mean, is there a historical? Is it because Christianity becomes more established, or is there a breaking point that things?
So, I mean, I think it's kind of like tipping point, but Yorgos would argue that the temple conversion in Naxos, do you remember arguing this? The temple conversion in Naxos is much earlier, so he would say that the Temple of Demeter occurs in the 5th century.
We have the momentum of temple conversions from the second half of the 5th century onwards. That's the general picture.
Except in places like Athens, where it's not until much later.
Yes, the end of the 5th century.
And the reason is because Christianity is already well established.
That's-
they can
yeah.
move in. And
That's, I mean, I think
Also, yeah.
I think it's partly,
Legislation makes
and so
difference, yeah.
what do you do with temple lands? So
Also,
um,
confiscation of temple lands, many things. Yeah.
but also the symbol. They're not so much symbols anymore. So for a long time, you have in the Theodosian Code, for example, you must look after. Although on the one hand it's saying don't go to the polytheistic temples, then on the other hand it's saying but look after them because they're your cultural heritage. So there's a very keen awareness that there needs to be the importance of the temples is kept up, but not to sacrifice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have the feeling, however, that focusing on churches, fourth century churches, and mostly drawn from material evidence, gives us a distorted picture of how things develop. Because, I mean, comparing Antioch, a mega city with perhaps the most important Christian community of the whole East, with much smaller centers like Salamis, which was not even a provincial capital,
No.
or Athens, which was not a provincial capital, or other places, Apamea, etc., and suggesting that, look, the earliest church in Antioch was late 3rd century, and 4th century we have late 4th century we have a church in Salamis, gives us a little bit distorted picture of how things develop, because I mean Antioch was the Christian city of the whole East.
Yeah. No, I mean you're right, but I deliberately
We
was.
should always combine the literary sources. And Antioch, we know about this late 3rd century church, not from the material evidence. It's because
Yeah.
an ecclesiastical historian says something about the Palea and the Nea built by Constantine and Constantius II.
Yeah.
So, taking only the material evidence as our guide, I think it's always.
No, I mean you're right in the sense that you can't ignore it. But I mean I did want to draw on those material
not
for the
monumental,
Palea and stuff.
but yeah.
And I also think it's worth comparing tiny little places like Bad Aegean, because, I mean, it's a similar kind of process. It's not that size matters or that provincial designation matters. I mean, size matters in terms of the number of people that are going to go there, but I mean, it doesn't have to be millions of people that are necessarily going there. And if you look at somewhere like Apamea, where millions of people are going, it doesn't really happen.
Yeah, but we have a bishopric in Apamea quite early in the 4th century, while for Paros.
And a bishopric in Paris.
And it's not an uncontroversial case, this.
No, I know.
Yeah,
No.
so.
Join the shared nerds.
Let me ask you a question. I'm sure there's a long list of references that one can look at, but I wanted to hear your opinion. You mentioned, you referred to the Tetrachon Basilica in Athens.
Yes.
Well, considering the fact that the rest of the city is Christianized through the construction or the transformation rather of polytheistic temples into churches until late, and the fact that this is an early basilica, what is there graphic or other evidence? What do you think was the reaction of the population that seems to have been pagan until, I mean, quite late in relation in comparison to other cities, to have such a large monument, Christian monument, of the Roman Agora?
So there's lots of debate about whether it is actually a basilica or not. And so it depends on whether you want to go with it. I'd be interested to hear what Yorgos thinks. Whether you want to go with it being a basilica. So if you want to have a loaded paper in favour of what I was saying, then you don't want it to be a basilica. You want the earliest basilica to be Iliopsoas Basilica. But I think it literally swings backwards and forwards on whether that is a basilica or not. And they just don't have enough evidence to say either way. I mean,
Fair enough, yeah.
so, I mean, I think a later date for that as a kind of a church building is more secure anyway, although there's probably, it's over the fountain area anyway. Yorgos, what did you think about that one?
Personally, I take for granted that it's a church, so, yeah.
Aha, we can start a whole new debate.
Okay, just another. I thought it was interesting. I mean, the fact I come from Paris and I never thought of it, but the church of Acropolis is. I was trying to think in relation to its topography because that's interesting to its location within the late antique town. In contrast to other cases that you compared with, it's interesting that this is a church and it's substantial, it's big and it's elaborate. It's off the center. Usually we see churches of that scale in focal points and prominent sites within a city or outside. I think Acropolis lies a bit off the center.
It does, but it's in the cemetery. It's in the Roman cemetery. And so my argument would be that they're drawing on that Roman cemetery in order to situate itself. And it's also possible that the baptistry itself was the earliest part of that foundation. Possible.
What is the latest about the dating of the Acropolis then according to recent?
So pottery people will say it's later. They say it's
Later than.
so they say mid-5th century.
You mean until you talk about the Constantinian foundation?
Yeah. Oh, and then you have the later stuff on top of that as well. But it depends, and it depends on whether you want to update or downdate the pottery.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? No. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Like us on Facebook.